So, who pulls off projects? Well, it's organizations. So today, we're going to talk about the pros and cons in the way you go about running a project. So we'll be talking about these topics and we'll be covering Chapter 2. Now, the Airbus 380, there were basically two different strategies involved. Boeing took the strategy of building mid-size airplanes, whereas Airbus built these big monster airplanes that could fit 850 people compared to the standard like 400 people. And as it turns out, the U.S. company ended up winning. And the reason why is there were pros and cons to the two approaches. One thought was, well, we needed really big airplanes because airports can't get any bigger and you can't have as many flights and things like that. And the way Boeing looked at it is, well, there are a lot of emerging nations in the world. They're not going to have airports well suited for really large airplanes, so we should go smaller. And there's really not a right or wrong answer, but Boeing ended up winning. And what had ended up happening is, based on the vision of the organization, you came up with two very different kinds of projects. What it comes down to is your projects reflect your strategy and your biases. Is your attitude go big? Is your attitude to go small? Is your attitude to be flexible? And as you can see through a lot of these examples, based on the strategy, it leads to what kind of projects companies go after. Stakeholders. Who are stakeholders? Stakeholders are anyone who can impact the outcome or the execution of a project. And so doing analysis to figure out who these stakeholders are going to be. Now, the thing is, you start entering like second order stakeholders and third order stakeholders and things like that. For example, for Intel, who's their stakeholders? Is it the computer makers or is it the people who buy computers? And that's what I mean by second order. Project stakeholders are those who actually have an active stake in what's going on, and that's who we tend to focus on. We have internal and we have external stakeholders. Internal stakeholders are people within the company. So it's management, QA, manufacturing, all of those. And external stakeholders are like your customers, your competitors, your suppliers, those who have an impact on what you go ahead and do. When we look at the relationship, you are responsible for managing all these different kinds of people, whether they're other managers and departments, what's going on externally, your top management, your team itself, and so on and so forth. Now, in terms of managing your stakeholders, you figure out what's going on, identify what the goals are and what everybody's goals are, and then assess what you're capable of doing, what you're not capable of doing. What a lot of people do not do is define the problem and define the objectives, meaning a real objective has to be something that's achievable, that is relevant, can be done in time. They're called SMART goals. You want to develop solutions and to test and refine those solutions. Major stakeholders need to be identified before you reach the planning stage. And that makes sense because you're going to pick some of these stakeholders to be part of your plan. So how can I ask these people to be part of the planning if I haven't identified them yet? So how do I organize this? Well, the things I need to consider, and there are three elements, is how are people going to report to each other? What kind of groupings make sense to be most efficient? And how am I going to design these systems so that I have a good channel of communication, I have coordination, and I can integrate all the different groups together. So this leads to the following types of organizations. You have functional organizations where people are grouped together by what they do, like engineering. Project organizations where people go into project teams. One company that's very good at this is actually Cisco. What Cisco does is when they have a new product coming out, they put together an integrated stakeholder team called Tiger Teams. And the Tiger Teams basically work on a project, and it's typically 2 or 3 years before the product goes out the door. And then once it goes out the door, they break the team up, and then everybody, shakes hands and hugs and cries, and they eat cake, and then everybody goes on to their new assignments. Matrix organizations mean that, like, for example, engineering, well, I have 4 different projects, and so 4 different projects all intersect with engineering. And so, in effect, engineering is sort of like a service provider, and each of the projects are like customers. And so you have this organization that overlaps together, and subsequently you don't necessarily have direct reports. In a matrix organization, you don't report to the project, you report to your home department. I was a program manager, and that's really tough when people don't report directly to you. That's actually the advantage of having things like hierarchy, because you can go ahead and have people directly report to you. When they don't, now this is your challenge as a leader, and that's how much influence can you have over a situation. A typical functional organization looks like this, and normally you have a CEO and you have a whole bunch of VPs reporting to that CEO. You might have a COO, an operating officer, or a technology officer, or a strategy officer, and so on and so forth. But typically you break up your departments into marketing, production, finance, and they keep research, which is basically new product development, apart. So what's good and bad about this structure? Well, you have to think about the individuals. And what are individuals concerned with? Because those are the people who are going to pull this off. Long term, what's going to happen to me? What's my career path? And the other is, who do I report to? Who do I have to answer to? And a lot of people are driven by that. One thing that Dr. Cho has been really bad about in his career is I've always been the guy who, I don't care who I report to. My general feeling is my responsibility is to my project and to the company and to do what's best for them. I don't really care about my boss. Don't tell Professor Harada that. Anyway, I don't make a lot of friends. Anyway, as you can imagine, the weaknesses of such a structure is everybody's siloed. Everybody just cares about their home departments. And when you have a project, you need a lot of cross-pollination. You need to have interdisciplinary type work when you pull projects off, because problems today, especially with technology, are just too complicated. So this is what a project organization looks like. And instead of having this hierarchical structure, you still have it. But what ends up happening is the people actually belong to the project itself. This is probably the strongest approach if you're project driven. You have effective decision making. It's the project that drives your company. On the other hand, it's really expensive to do this because you need more management. You have more pieces. And what happens is you worry about whether or not people are going to be loyal to you and the company, or are they loyal just to their project and their team. And what happens also is it becomes difficult to keep, everyone together. Because you go to a project you don't like, then people tend to walk and leave. And people are also concerned. When this project ends, where am I going to go to next? And actually, that brings up the Cisco question. But the people at Cisco, actually, their attitude is, I trust the company. If I do well, then I'm going to get a more challenging task next time I come along. Now, matrix organizations I talked about before, and that's that each individual silo, they're offering a service, and you as a project have to go and try to convince them. So this technique became very popular in the 1980s, 1990s, and everybody was about, sharing resources and being efficient and everything else. The problem with that approach is that you've got 2 bosses, so who do you answer to? And also you're sharing resources. And so you have all these program or project managers competing against each other, fighting for the same resource. And so for you might have a guy and they say, you're 80% on this project and 20% on this project. Well, the problem is if you're on the 20% side, that 20% is more or less just zero because people typically aren't very good at multitasking. And not only that, but if you say, okay, 20%, you only get 8 hours a week out of me, then maybe that's not enough. And so what ends up happening is that workers get confused. They get trapped between the two. And what ends up happening is they start thinking about, okay, well, who signs my paychecks? And that tends to be the overriding thing. There are some companies that are really good at project management organizations. The ones who typically do it, if you're a regulated industry, you need a project management organization. And it's because there are so many regulations and paperwork and everything else that you have to keep track of. You can't do it in a matrix organization. You have to have somebody directly responsible for it. So defense, biomedical, these are the kind of industries that are heavily regulated. If we look at effectiveness of different organizations, let's talk about construction. Well, for new product development, it's about the project organization. That's the best. That kind of makes a lot of sense, because if I'm coming out with a new product, I want everybody focused on the product. On the other hand, if you're in construction, why is project matrix the best approach to do it? And the reason why is when you're in construction, you can have lots of different construction projects, and therefore you need a certain degree of flexibility, which a matrix organization gives you. The central heart of all of this is the Project Management Office, or PMO. And what it is, it's the resource center. It's the control tower of technical details, expertise. It's the center of excellence for your company. There are different kinds of controls that PMOs use. One is supportive, which means low control, meaning they're there more to be a reference. Controlling means moderate control, and that means they have certain standards and things you have to be compliant to. And direct control means they actually have people in your project who you have to directly. The way you can kind of think about it is, are you a weather station where you're just monitoring, tracking? Are you a control tower where essentially you guide people in? Or are you a resource pool where you provide the skilled professionals to help you pull it off? In terms of a control tower, what do? You establish standards for the project, you consult how to follow them, enforce it, and improve standards. The thing about coming up with rules is unless you enforce it, and unless you enforce it consistently, people aren't going to pay attention to it. People aren't going to do what they need to do. So let's do a problem. The management department at the university decides to add a new program in restaurant, hotel, and institutional management. As part of the development process, they hold focus groups consisting of area business leaders, current and former students, and restaurant and hotel owners. These groups can be described as, well, considering I have a restaurant, hotel, and institutional management program, what do all these people do? Well, are they project leaders? No. When you have a multiple choice test, typically you can throw some of the answers away right away. And then what it comes down to is, instead of having a 1 in 5 chance, now you have a 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 chance. So your odds are much better. Of course, knowing the answer, yeah, that works too. Project leaders, project workers, stakeholders, clients, project team members. These guys could be project team members, but some of them are external. So they're not going to be committed to working on this every day. They're not all leaders. They might be workers. Some of them are clients, some of them aren't. So now I'm down to stakeholders and workers. And so clearly these are stakeholders, not project workers. Which statement about stakeholders is best? Stakeholders wield considerable power. Stakeholders can potentially impact project execution. Stakeholders are external to a company. By definition, clients are not stakeholders, but customers. Okay, one thing we do know is that our customers can be stakeholders, so I can throw D out right away. Stakeholders wield considerable power. Well, yes and no. Some stakeholders hold more power than others. Naturally, the customer, especially if you're doing a project for a customer and they're paying you, have tremendous power. This could be right, but it may not be right. This is one thing that is really tough about these kind of quizzes, and this is what you actually get when you take the PMBOK if you want to become certified. And that's that there's more than one correct answer, but there's only one best answer. And so this is what this is. Yes, this could be true, it may not be true. Stakeholders are external to a company. Well, that's not true, because we know we have internal and external. So now, again, elimination, I've got down to these two. Stakeholders can potentially impact project execution. That's always true. Again, if they're not, then they're not a stakeholder. Stakeholders wield considerable power. Sometimes it's true, and so we know the answer is B. What's next is you build up your project plan. I'm not really going to go over this because all this does is outline what's in your book. And so you can look at that. But what this is it helps you as a guide in order to do your PT projects.